All right, so let's wrap up this class, shall we? Here's where we left off on Monday. I introduced this idea of water quality trading, in particular for non-point source pollution. There's not direct regulations on non-point sources. The EPA's Clean Water Act doesn't actually touch non-point sources, agricultural sources directly. It kind of gives them advice and guidance, but it doesn't actually have any regulatory teeth to enforce any direct penalties on farmers for their practices. And so the idea with water quality trading is the enforcement is on the point sources. So the wastewater treatment facilities, for example, which discharge nitrogen and phosphorus, are the ones that they might have their standards tightened and increased, and they have to meet stricter standards, but they're able to meet those standards by basically purchasing offsets from agricultural sources. So they can try to meet their regulatory requirements by purchasing credits or offsets or nutrient reductions from other kinds of cheaper non-point sources. And that's kind of the idea behind water quality trading. The basic idea is that you're eligible to produce what are called credits, which then are valuable in the market, which you can sell to other polluters, just like a kind of a cap and trade system. And so you can generate these credits if you reduce your emissions below what's required by law. But the problem comes in that non-point sources, like I said, they don't have any formal legal requirements under the Clean Water Act. There's no direct penalties on ag sources for not meeting particular things. And so there's not a legal baseline in the same way that there is for like a point source, which maybe has to meet some discharge level. Maybe their discharges of nitrogen or phosphorus or other kinds of chemicals have to be below a certain amount. That's required by law, but non-point sources don't have that same legal requirement. So we talked about last time how the trick is to figure out how to set a baseline, how to define a baseline for those agricultural sources. And so we had an example with two farmers. We had Farmer Brown, he had already cleaned up quite a bit of his runoff, and he had sort of managed his runoff to a large extent already. James Harden, great scorer, but he didn't do very much for his nutrient runoff. So the initial levels that these guys are at are, just for these simple examples that I made up, 1,600 pounds of nitrogen discharge per year from James Harden, only 1,000 pounds for Farmer Brown. Let's look at some of the difficulties and some of the kind of peculiarities of having to choose a baseline here. So we noted how there were three options. You can set the baseline according to their existing discharges. So we define each farmer's baseline as their existing discharges. So that'll be 1,600 for James Harden, 1,000 for Farmer Brown. Now, one of the problems is if Farmer Brown is already at, for example, if Farmer Brown is already at 1,000 pounds per year, his marginal reduction costs are a lot higher. So if he wants to generate credits, he has to move below 1,000 and get something below that, which is, it's going to have a higher marginal cost. So it's going to be more expensive for Farmer Brown to generate credits. Whereas James Harden is starting from a baseline of 1,600, his reductions are going to be relatively cheap. He gets to generate credits and make money off of that, whereas Farmer Brown had sort of already made those improvements, but wasn't able to make money on that because he was an early adopter. So it kind of is implicitly penalizing Farmer Brown for having been an early adopter and kind of a good steward of his resources before he had an opportunity to make money off of it. That's option one. So it's a little bit unfair. It's kind of it sort of rewards James Harden for not doing a good job in the first place, and it sort of implicitly penalizes Farmer Brown for having done a good job in the first place. Okay, so now the second option would be to define the baseline as Farmer Brown's discharge level. So you sort of require the polluters to get up to this 1,000 pounds per year level before they can generate any credits. So Farmer Brown can start generating credits as soon as he gets below 1,000. He's already at 1,000, so he's well on his way to being able to generate credits to be able to sell and make some money off of his conservation. James Harden, on the other hand, has to, even before he can generate credits, he has to incur all of these costs to get from 1,600 to 1,000. He has to incur all of this cost. If we look at the area below the marginal reduction cost curve, he has to spend all that money to get from 1,600 to 1,000, even before he's able to start generating a single credit. And potentially what this could do is this could actually maybe discourage James Harden from even trying. If he knows that he has to get all the way to 1,000 before he's even eligible to start generating a credit, he may decide that that's too expensive. All those resources I'd have to spend up front to get to 1,000 first are not worth the extra benefits I could get by selling credits when I reduce below 1,000. And so maybe I'll just decide not to reduce, which is unfortunate because James Harden, from a cost effectiveness perspective, James Harden has the most cost effective reductions on the map. The most cost effective ways to reduce nitrogen are to get rid of this very high level that James Harden is already at. So if you're trying to think about how can I clean up nitrogen most cost effectively, James Harden is who you'd actually want to clean up the most pollution because he's so far down the marginal reduction cost curve. He's starting from such a high pollution level that his initial reductions are very cheap. From society's perspective, you'd want him to reduce the most because his reductions are the cheapest. You get the most bang for your buck at James Harden. But if you set a very strict baseline at 1,000, you can discourage him from doing that. All right, and then finally we have option 3. Recall that one of the important characteristics of a payments for ecosystem services program is additionality. If we're designing a payments for ecosystem services program, we would like to have the money that we're spending, the public money that we're spending on conservation, we'd like to have that going towards new conservation, extra conservation that would not have happened otherwise. If we're paying people to do things that they would do anyways, we're not getting any additional benefit of those public funds. So keep that in mind for option 3. Option 3 is that we set the baseline at James Harden's discharge level of 1,600. We set a very relaxed baseline, we set a high baseline. Now, James Harden can start generating credits immediately. James Harden's not going to be discouraged from generating credits. That takes care of the option 2 problem. Also, Farmer Brown gets paid for the reductions that he's already done, getting from 1,600 to 1,000. He gets paid for that, so he gets rewarded. He gets monetary rewards for being an early adopter. So the fairness issue is sort of taken care of. The problem is that paying this money to Farmer Brown based on the reductions that he's done in the past or the systems that he's built in the past, which are going to guarantee that he maintains his reductions from 1,600 to 1,000 every single year for the next 10 or 20 years. We know that he's designed runoff control systems that allow him to control his runoff, to absorb the nutrients, to reduce his nutrient runoff. He's going to be doing that for the next 20 years, regardless of whether you pay him, because he's already built the systems. That is paying for reductions of nitrogen that would happen anyway. That would happen whether or not you made those payments. So that sort of violates the one of the key criteria of payments for ecosystem services programs, which is that the payments be additional. We'd like to have them be additional, and it's a little bit of a waste of money to spend money on things that don't add additional kinds of pollution reduction or conservation. So unfortunately, option 3 solves both the problems associated with the first 2, but it introduces this non-additionality, which is a little bit unattractive. So that's the trade-offs with this baseline choice. Is you sort of anything you choose, you're going to be kind of having some undesirable characteristics, and it's just a question of which of these 3 options do you find least undesirable, and choosing that. But you have to make trade-offs.
So for option 3, the benefits are that it results in immediate credits for both of them, and the cons again are, could you just go over those again, please?
So both can start generating credits immediately. So James Harden is going to have an incentive to reduce right away, and he's the lowest cost reductions anyway, so that's a good thing. It rewards Farmer Brown for having been an early adopter, so it satisfies kind of our definition of fairness. The cons is the lack of additionality. You're paying Farmer Brown for something that was already going to happen. So you're sort of spending public resources for conservation that has, in a sense, already occurred. It's not extra conservation. It's not extra nutrient reductions. It's nutrient reductions which have already happened, which are already going to happen in the future, regardless of whether you actually make a payment or not. So it's like, you pay money and you get zero extra reductions from it, at least up until the 1,000 level. If Farmer Brown starts reducing below 1,000, you get those are additional amounts of reductions, but the amounts you're paying him between 1,600 and 1,000 are non-additional. You're paying him for stuff that was already going to happen anyway. So yeah, that's just kind of applying some of the economic logic of kind of marginal costs and equity and fairness and additionality. That's kind of all three of those are kind of wrapped up in this idea of trying to design a baseline for non-regulated sources of pollution. So this is the last kind of very quick topic I want to hit. And again, I sort of added this a little bit on the fly because I noticed there's a lot of you that were interested in renewable energy sources and integrating them into United States energy portfolio or the global energy portfolio. And I want to just hit a couple of the points about how electricity systems are designed and operated and managed, and what that implies for kind of some of the challenges that are in place for renewable energy, for increasing the share of renewable energy that makes up our total energy portfolio. So first of all, what an energy portfolio, you can just think about that as the shares of energy sources, the stocks of different kinds of energy that go towards meeting all of the end uses in an economy or in a country. So a lot of it's going to come from oil, natural gas, coal. Those are the fossil fuel resources which make up 65% of the United States energy portfolio. And then there's other kinds of sources like nuclear, hydropower, some solar, some wind, some biomass, burning biomass products for energy. But broadly speaking, the factors that are going to matter a lot for what goes into a country's energy portfolio are the price of those resources, or maybe you can think of it as the cost of those resources. How costly is it to acquire those sources in terms of both the capital costs and the marginal fuel costs? So electricity generation is going to require both investments in capital and equipment, as well as the actual fuel. And different energy resources are going to have different shares of their costs, which come from the fuel versus the fixed capital costs. Renewable energy sources have high capital costs. It takes a lot to develop those technologies and to build them and install them. It's a high capital cost, but it's a very low fuel cost because the fuel is essentially free. So in any kind of energy resource you're considering, you're sort of balancing off the total costs with the fixed costs and also with the variable costs of the fuel inputs. Net energy is another consideration. This is how much energy you get from the fuel, from that type of energy resource, minus kind of what is required to discover, explore for it, mine it, extract it, and actually turn it into electricity. So fossil fuel resources, coal, natural gas, tend to have very high net energies. Those are very energy dense kinds of fuels, and they have very high net energy. Something like biomass or biofuels have very low net energy, where it takes a lot of energy to grow the corn or to grow the sugar cane, a lot of energy to process it and turn it into biofuel or ethanol. And so the net energy of something like ethanol is very low compared to something like coal or oil. But that's a factor in determining the energy portfolio. Different energy resources are going to have different sorts of characteristics that make them more or less suitable for different purposes. So the fact that petroleum can be converted to gasoline, which is an extremely energy dense kind of fuel that can be easily transported through a pipe, stored in tanks, distributed at gas stations, put into your car's fuel tank and burned in your car, that makes it a very convenient fuel to use for transportation because it's extremely energy dense. When you fill up your car with 10 or 15 gallons of gasoline, it's just an enormous transfer of energy out of that gas storage tank into your car. You're getting a huge amount of energy being transferred into your car, and it's relatively lightweight for the amount of energy that it gives, and it's very portable, so you can drive it around and use it in transportation. So that's also going to be, those are some of the other characteristics of energy, some of the physical characteristics of energy that make it more or less desirable to have as part of your energy portfolio. Okay, then of course environmental concerns are a big part of it. Different kinds of fuels have different CO2 emissions. Obviously, solar and wind have basically none, at least in terms of the marginal energy production. There's some associated with the capital, the production of the capital equipment, but overall it has very low environmental impact. Whereas the fossil fuels, which have very high energy density, very low cost, in the case of petroleum, very suitable properties for transportation, those have a high environmental impact and large environmental consequences. So that's going to be sort of rating a little bit lower on that environmental impact factor. Okay, and then the availability is another important factor for just considering how much energy you use in an economy. Right now, fossil fuels are not urgently scarce. Of course, there's a fixed amount, but we're not running out of them, at least in the foreseeable future. But eventually, it's a fixed stock that we have in the earth. So eventually, we're going to get close to extracting more and more of those and starting to get more towards the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. But for renewable energy, we don't really have a limited supply. There's sort of an abundance of solar energy which hits the earth every second. There's a lot of wind currents generated on the surface of the earth that can be harnessed if we have the right technology to do so. So those are available sort of long term. But the key thing for this renewable energy management is having them available when you need them to be available. They are available kind of long term as sort of like always guaranteed to be there as long as the sun exists, but not necessarily available at the particular instances when you need to balance demand and supply on the electricity grid. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that availability factor is important for these renewable sources. All right, so broadly speaking, electricity, this next part is particularly about electricity production, not so much fuel for transportation, but specifically for electricity production. The way that this is set up is that you have, broadly speaking, generators who convert energy resources into electricity. They convert the coal, the natural gas, the moving water, the solar energy. They convert that to useful electrons, which are going to be flowing through the wires and eventually being transmitted to end uses. That generation gets ramped up to very high voltage and transmitted along large transmission lines, over long distances. And the reason that it's ramped up to very high voltage is because anytime you send electricity across a wire, you lose a little bit of it along the way. You lose some electricity the longer that you have that electricity sort of traveling along a wire. But you lose less when you have very high voltage. So if you can sort of increase the voltage, that's very good for sending that power, sending that electricity over long distances, over transmission lines. And then you take then eventually you get a transformer which will reduce the voltage and get it down to a voltage that's actually kind of more usable for household use and everyday use. And then you get to the part of the grid that deals with distribution. So that's sort of the end use, the household use or the industrial or business use of that electricity, where you actually end up putting that electricity that was generated far away, you put that to beneficial use at home. Now, in the 1990s, we ended up having lots of different generators pop up, and there ended up being deregulation. It used to be the case that this whole process, the generation, the transmission, and the distribution was all overseen by a single process. A single utility would oversee the entire thing from start to finish. In the 1990s, we still had utilities manage the transmission and the distribution, but the actual generation was outsourced or decentralized, and markets were allowed to emerge for generation, where now the monopoly utilities aren't the ones that are necessarily producing all the electricity. Now you have independent generators who are able to feed their electricity into the grid and compete with one another. They can compete with one another for who can produce the electricity at the lowest cost, and this competition has allowed energy bills to actually drop for consumers, as you get this competition in the market for electricity generation. And so this was part of the deregulation process that occurred in the 1990s. Whereas before the 1990s, electricity was kind of all vertically integrated from generation to transmission to distribution. And then in the 90s, you started to get deregulation and decentralization, where now you have all these privately operating generators popping up. If you wanted to, you could build a electricity generation facility and sell electricity into the market along with anybody else. You're free to do that now in most areas of the country where that deregulation has taken place. Now, the particular thing about electricity grids is that electricity is subject to the laws of physics. And if electricity is being generated at one point, it's going to just flow along the wire subject to the laws of physics. It doesn't necessarily know that there's a buyer or a seller of the electricity. It's just going to follow the wire and go from the place where it's being generated to some end use, following the laws of physics along the grid. And one of the things that means is that there's actually a very tight physical constraint on the supply of electricity, which comes from generators. So this left-hand side is the supply, and the right-hand side is the demand. And those have to be very, very close to each other on a minute-by-minute basis. There's some margin for error where you can have some variation within a very tiny window. But if the supply relative to demand drops too low, you end up with blackouts. If the supply gets too big, too high relative to demand, you get surges and you start to blow things up. And so the operators of these grids, of these electricity grids, have to be managing supply and demand on almost a continuous basis, minute by minute. And this is what makes it very difficult with renewable sources. We talked a little bit about them a second ago, but how they're not available all the time, or sometimes they're available in very large quantities, but you can't predict exactly when that's going to be. And so this poses a little bit of a problem for the managers of these electricity grids, who are trying to walk this very thin tightrope of equating supply and demand. And when you have renewable sources, which you might be able to forecast a little bit, but there's still a lot of variability in those and uncertainty with what you're actually going to get, that makes it very tricky to balance out the supply and the demand on the grid, as a grid operator is trying to manage those load levels relative to supplies on a continuous basis. So you could think about electricity demand over a certain period of time. Let's say over the course of a day. Let's say this is over the course of a day. You have nighttime on the edges here, where electricity demand is relatively low. People have their lights turned off. If it's the summertime, they don't have to have their air conditioner turned on as high, and so you have less electricity required to be produced in the nighttime periods of the day. And there's some minimum amount. We call this the base load. There's some minimum amount which is required to be met sort of at all times of day. We need to have a certain amount of electricity being produced continuously at all times of day in order to meet this base load demand, sort of the minimum demand that needs to be met at any point during the day. But then certain times of day, of course, have much higher electricity use than others. And so you have to be able to not just meet base load, but you have to be able to meet these peaks within the day, where you are able to increase production, increase generation at particular times of day in order to match this increase in demand and be able to meet the peak load that is going to be sort of midday. Kind of in the summertime, you can think about this as maybe the hottest part of the day when everybody's air conditioners are kind of turned up on full blast to keep the temperature regulated inside. So again, grid managers are trying to manage this tricky system. Let me just point out this particular we have this kind of requirement for some kind of ability to ramp on and off. Coal and nuclear plants are going to be very bad at that. They require very long lead times, sometimes like 24 hours. So they're very hard to ramp up quickly. What's typically required for quick, rapid generation, easy ramp up times, is typically something like a natural gas generator, which sort of the average time or the average rate at which they can ramp up is something on the order of 25 megawatts per minute. Keep that number in your head. I'll explain a little bit more about kind of the context for that number and what that number means for grid management in a second, but keep that number in your head. Roughly 25 megawatts per minute is what's required. It's kind of the average ramp up time for a natural gas generator. Okay, let me just talk just for a second about kind of how electricity prices emerge. So along with this decentralized generation of electricity, the way that operators set prices in this market, remember there's decentralized generators. Anybody can build a plant and sell electricity into the grid if they like. The way that operators kind of manage the price and the demand is they take bids. Anybody that wants to be eligible to produce electricity over in a given day is going to submit a bid to the grid operator. They're going to say, I can generate electricity at X dollars per megawatt for this time of day, and I'm willing to accept, something at least that much in order to produce at that hour of the day. And then another generator, maybe they have high fuel costs. They're going to be willing to produce electricity, but they're going to have a much higher bid because their marginal costs are higher. Maybe their fuel stock is much more costlier to burn, and so they can't bid as low, but they can still produce if the price is high enough. So you get these bids. Some of them are going to be very low. People that have very low fuel costs are going to be bidding low, and the regulator is going to the grid operator is going to organize these bids from lowest to highest. Some are going to be low, some of them are going to be very high, and then the operator is going to consider, okay, what's my demand? Maybe this is the market for like 4 p.m. to 4:05 p.m. during the day, and so these markets are very narrowly defined in time, where the markets kind of there's separate markets for like different 5-minute intervals across the day when these generators are submitting bids. So maybe there's some 4 o'clock to 4:05 has some capacity that's required, right? So the generator says, or the grid operator says, okay, I need to have X number of megawatt hours being able to be generated at that 4 p.m. to 4:05 hour. So that's going to correspond to some level on this horizontal axis. And so maybe this is somewhere right here. And so the electricity price, they take all the lowest bids, and they contract with all the generators that are willing to produce at those lowest bids, and they offer them the price at which the marginal bid, the last bid that's required to meet demand, whatever the marginal cost of that bid is, or whatever the marginal bid was, that's the price of electricity. And then the quantity that you have is all of these guys, all these bids earlier are going to be producing, and then that will add up to X amount of electricity being produced during that very narrow time slot. So that's just a little bit of how electricity prices are set on a very narrow time window, on like a 5-minute time horizon. Now there's this idea of net load. We talked about how managing load, load fluctuates throughout the day. It's sort of low during the night, but then it peaks during the middle of the day. Net load is a very important concept when you have renewables being a prominent part of the electricity grid. So net load is defined as electricity demand minus production from variable sources like solar and wind, which you can't directly control how much the sun is shining or how much the wind is blowing at these sources. So your net load, it's no longer that you have to just worry about the fact that demand is going to peak at some point, during the middle of the day and then go down during the night. You also have to account for the fact that your net load, the amount of electricity that you need minus what's being sort of fed into the grid naturally by these renewable sources, is going to be fluctuating along with however much the renewable sources themselves are fluctuating. And so what this leads to, difficulties forecasting. If you're a grid operator that's trying to manage this very thin tightrope of, the supply of electricity along with the demand of electricity on a minute by minute basis, and you have these renewable sources which are becoming more prominent in the grid, those make it much more difficult to predict exactly how much of like the controllable sources like natural gas, coal, nuclear, those sources that you can turn on and off. The fact that the renewable sources are generating variable amounts and the supply of those are going up and down throughout the day, it makes forecasting the net load very, very difficult to do. And in particular, one of the things that makes this very hard is that it requires a very steep ramp in the late afternoon. And this is where that 25 megawatts per minute number comes in. So there's something called the duck curve, which is the amount of net electricity that's required during the day, which as we've incorporated more renewables into the grid, this curve of this net electricity has been, it's been low during the night, then it's increased, and then it's been kind of flat. It's flat during the middle of the day in 2012 because energy demand is high, but also renewable production during the day is high when the sun is shining. So it kind of flattened out a little bit, and then it would increase sort of in the late afternoon into the evening. And then as more and more renewable sources got plugged into the grid, this trough in the middle part of the day started to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And by 2020, we have a very deep, decline in net load, and then a very steep ramp up in the late afternoon. So there is, here's a typical spring day. This one looks a lot more like a duck than the previous one. Here's the head of the duck. Here's the body of the duck. Here's the tail. That looks quite a bit like a duck. For this kind of spring day, between the hours of like 3 p.m. and 6 or 7 p.m., and in particular, there's like a 3-hour window right here where we need to have 13,000 megawatts sort of coming online in about a 3-hour window because the sun is starting to set. So the angle of the sun is getting shallower and shallower. And so the amount of production from solar is declining rapidly. Energy use is still pretty high in between the hours in 3 to 6. So you need to have like natural gas or something else to make up the slack as the solar production starts to get reduced, but as electricity demand stays flat. And you need about 13,000 megawatts in about 3 hours. And so we had about 25 megawatts per minute, which was what a typical natural gas. Those are the fastest ramping up generators we have. And if we think about that over a 3-hour window, that's 180 minutes. That will get you about 4,500 megawatts, which is only about a third of what you need for this 13,000 megawatt ramp up between the hours of like 3 and 6 p.m. or 4 and 7 p.m. or something like that. So what this means is that maybe a city has maybe just one natural gas generator. Maybe they only need one. They typically only need one to sort of be able to meet peak load. But if they have this more and more renewables coming onto the grid, making this trough here in the middle lower and lower, requiring a steeper ramp, they might need to build an additional 2 natural gas facilities in order to be able to accommodate that increase in demand during that critical period of the day where the net load kind of ramps up very rapidly and accelerates rapidly in that late afternoon period. And it might actually, the integration of more renewables into the grid might actually require more of these kinds of fossil fuel plants to be constructed in order to accommodate this very rapid switching on and off that's required when you have a lot of these variable sources, these intermittent sources being integrated into the grid. That's one issue is the ramping up. The other issue is that when you have lots of renewable sources like solar and wind selling into the market at those critical times of day, they tend to bid the price down. Because they're very cheap, they have a very low marginal cost, they can bid the price down, and it causes electricity prices to fall really, really rapidly during the middle parts of the day. And it kind of makes it less attractive as a renewable energy generator to actually invest in more of those. Because if you invest in a renewable generator, but the only times you can produce are during the middle of the day when the price is really low, you sort of have less and less of an ability to make money. So it's like this interesting paradox of how the subsidies of solar and wind, let me spell that right, subsidies for solar and wind have led to this sort of deflation of the price in the middle of the day. Subsidies have led to depressed prices, which makes renewable energies even less attractive. and it sort of requires, more subsidies. So the more as we've sort of increased the subsidies for renewable energy, the attractiveness of the investments in those sources, because of this sort of peculiarity of how the grid is operated and how electricity, the physical properties of electricity and how you manage it, those subsidies increase renewables, which then deflates prices, which then makes renewables become even less of a attractive investment, and sort of undermines its own success as kind of an investment proposition. And that's kind of the interesting economic paradox of how to integrate these better into the grid. And there's ideas about having better storage, having better ways to accommodate fluctuating demand during the day, having more transmission lines which can send the power somewhere else over long distances to satisfy other kinds of energy demand that's not getting saturated at a point in time. But it's a very tricky problem, and I just wanted to introduce you to it a little bit. I can't go in a super high amount of depth with the time I have in this class, but this is some of the tricks and the difficulties and the challenges with renewable energy. And I put up some readings that you can go to Moodle to get more of this if you want to. But I just wanted to introduce some of this to you, given that a lot of you had some interest in this topic based on what you had said in the beginning of class. So that's all for today's class. We're at 10:51. I just wanted to say thanks for your participation and your involvement in the class so far this semester. Thanks for joining me at 10 a.m. every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Thanks for coming to office hours and having conversations with me in office hours. This was a lot of fun to do this, and thanks for being a part of it. Thanks for making this possible, and hopefully I'll see you over the next couple of days for discussions and questions that you might have regarding either of the remaining parts of the class that we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much,
so
Aaron.
much.